Impersonating websites. If we want to harvest credentials such as usernames and passwords, we will most probably need to perform website cloning. After hosting our clone website on a web server, we can then direct our victims via a phishing email to visit the website, and hopefully the victim will fall for it, submitting his username and password for us to capture. The old school way of doing this is literally cloning the website by saving the client-side code such as HTML, JavaScript, CSS, images, and other relevant files locally on our machine. We will then need to identify the URL endpoint of the login request and modify that to point to our web server instead, so that when the victim clicks on the login button, the request containing the username and password will be sent to us instead. Let's take a practical look on how this can be conducted. For this quick and simple demonstration, we will use my favorite shopping website, asos.com. Let's use this wget command to clone the client-side code of asos.com locally on our computer. We are getting a 403 forbidden error message because many websites will actually check for the user agent value. To prevent website scraping, the wget user agent is probably blacklisted. Let's change our user agent to Google Chrome instead. Awesome, this works now. It might take some time to complete depending on the website. The waiting time will be edited out. With the client-side code cloned on our computer, we will be able to host our clone copy of asos.com. Let's demonstrate this using a local web server with our local IP address instead. We can quickly spin up a web server with Python. Now let's visit our local web server that is hosting the clone copy of asos.com. If we were to try to log in, we can see that the login request will be sent to the actual asos.com. We don't want that as we want to capture the login details of our victim. What we can do here is to identify the login request URL endpoint and modify that to point to our own IP address endpoint instead. This will cause the login request to be sent to us. We will then be able to capture our victim's submitted credentials. We can easily identify the login request URL endpoint by inspecting the login button HTML element. This should be the login request URL endpoint over here. Let's look for this in our code and change it. Let's modify it so that the login request will be sent to our IP address on port 8081 instead. Now, let's set up a Netcat listener to capture the incoming login request. Please note that this is just a quick and dirty proof of concept for demonstration purposes. In reality, the fake login URL request should capture the credentials properly and gracefully redirect the victim to the actual site without breaking any flow. Awesome, so we have it. The classic old way of how we can impersonate a website and clone it in order to perform phishing for user data credentials harvesting. Now, the modern way of doing website impersonating and cloning is to actually use a reverse proxy tool, whereby you do not need to perform any form of website cloning at all. You will basically need to set up a reverse proxy, whereby it will redirect all the traffic to the legitimate website that you are trying to impersonate. The reverse proxy will need to handle the responses from the legitimate web server as well, redirecting the traffic back to the victim. This means that you will be positioned in a man-in-the-middle situation, being able to monitor all the traffic between your victim web browser and the legitimate web server. Sounds complicated? Fortunately, there are already tools out there available in performing this exact task. One popular example would be the Evilginx2. I will be briefly talking about the Evilginx2 and walking through an example on YouTube instead of a live demonstration. This is because most of the publicly available phishlets used by Evilginx2 are no longer working, and it is necessary to purchase a domain and spin up a server on the cloud. Creation of the phishlet will require some web application HTTP knowledge in order to debug and identify the correct parameters and session token value, which means that it is not really suitable for an introductory course like this. Alright, let's take a look at this article describing Evilginx2 and how it works. First, the attacker sends a fake URL like google.myfake.com to the victim. the content of google.myfake.com is from the legitimate Google service. The victim then falls for it and authenticates onto it. The real response of the legitimate Google service, which is denoted by the number 4 and 5, is then served to the victim. And if the service requires 2FA, which is number 6, the 2FA doesn't matter as it will be completed by the victim since the Evilginx2 reverse proxy is proxying the real 2FA challenge content. Once the entire authentication flow completes, the real Google service will issue a session token, and the attacker, being the reverse proxy, will now have access to the session cookie. The session cookie should already been 2FA elevated. Using the compromised session cookie, the attacker now has access onto the Google service as the victim. Alright, now let's take a look at a YouTube video example and walk it through for some more clarity. Let's take a look at this example. Let's fast forward to the part where we are interested in. Over here, we can see that Evilginx2 is already all set up, configured and running. The author is targeting the Microsoft sign-in page as shown in the video. We can see that the fake domain is computer-scanner.net. Now, imagine if the victim falls for it and authenticates onto it. In this example, the author of the video actually edited out the authentication part and the 2FA part. If the authentication is completed successfully by the victim, the username, password, as well as the 2FA elevated session cookie value will all be captured by Evilginx2. If this is still confusing to you, there are several resources available all over the internet on Evilginx2. Spend some time researching on it and you should be able to understand it better. Now that we have covered both the old school and the modern way of phishing for credentials, let's move on to the next lecture.